Welcome to the Tank Podcast. In this week's episode, Asad, Raza, Sougwen, Chung and Zhexi Zhang discuss the continuing relevance of Gaia theory in our contemporary moment. This talk was hosted at the As Above, So Below event at the Science Gallery.
Welcome to the afternoon session, which is Gaia Today, which is the broadest possible theme one could have to respond to in relation to this wonderful new book. So my name is Zhexi Zhang. I'm an artist and writer, and I'm joined today by two fellow artists who will very briefly try to explain a little bit of what they do, and also ask you to kind of maybe just open up with a little bit of a project of yours that comes to mind, or a strain of thinking that comes to mind for you in relation to Margulis and Lovelock, to Gaia, and this whole kind of theme today. So on the end is Sougwen Chung, who is newly based in London and runs a studio called Silicet. And I think Sougwen is best known for her painterly and gestural kind of works with AI and robots, largely with robotic arms, as I'm aware, but various iterations have been made over the years, exploring different kind of more mechanistic and more kind of neural iterations on collaboration in painting with robots. I think initially at MIT and Bell Labs, right? But now you're doing it here. And then we have Asad, Raza, who should not be associated with relational aesthetics, I'm told, but
That's fine, Gary. That's fine.
I think it sounds good.
Yeah, I think it sounds great. But makes wonderful. I've been thinking of as sort of performative and sculptural projects that kind of play with social metabolism, as well as material ones. You know, I believe you put a tennis court in a church at one point, and also brought a river running through a gallery. And I mean, metabolism is a theme that I think a lot about as well, because it's one of those meta-material concepts that can hold so much in its complexity. So yeah, maybe if you guys have any thoughts in relation to this kind of broad Gaia theme that through your own practices, and then we can dig a little deeper into them.
Would you like to begin?
Asad, I was looking at you, hoping you would begin, but I will. Okay, I will. I mean, I would say that all of my projects have probably been deeply influenced by Lynn Margulis and also by Edouard Glissant. Those are my two kind of people that I'm thinking about a lot of the time, and bringing them together is also something I think about. But just to, if you want to think, just to take one example, I guess the project that you just mentioned, which happened last summer in Frankfurt, was a piece of mine called Diversion, where we diverted the Main River through the Porticus Gallery. And for me, that there's a strain in Margulis's writing that has to do with taking the emphasis off of the kind of starring individual organism who competes with other organisms, and brings you into a focus on the kind of, as she calls it, symbiotic, and one of her master terms, symbiotic relations between organisms. And so I was thinking about the fact that every human city has a river running through the middle of it, because that river was originally a source of transport and connection and relation to other places and other regions. And yet almost all of those rivers have been dammed and channelized and concretized and also polluted, so that most people are afraid to touch the water of the river that's running through the middle of each city on the globe, which is many thousands of cities. So that's kind of a striking state of affairs. And I thought, in this kind of Gaiatic perspective, it could be interesting to try to just bring us into contact, to closer contact with an entity like a river. And so the idea of diverting the river through the gallery was not so that you could look at it as a spectacle only, but I had said from the very beginning, we need to be able to walk into the water. And then in the downstairs gallery, I wanted to take jugs of the water and filter them and boil them so that we could drink the river water. And I think that also relates a little bit to the Margulies' notion of this intricate set of exchange that occurs between different organisms. In her work, she often talks about the example of how bacterium first acquired mitochondria as a symbiotic kind of exchange where one bacteria really absorbs another one, and then it becomes the cell that runs all of multicellular life today. But in my case also, asking visitors to drink the river water and to walk in the river was somehow maybe a little bit of a way to go beyond simply representing visually a relationship to the river as an entity. So, I mean, for me, it's like these guiding themes are kind of all over my work, probably.
I would really love to see that in person at some point. Even conceptually, I think it's really striking. So my work, I think, comes to Margulies's through the development of a multi-generational cybernetic system. I've been working with the not marriage, this porosity between tradition and technology through gesture, as Gary mentioned, thinking about ways in which the human subject is implicated in the wider sort of technological sphere, starting really simply with implicating my own drawn gesture with different technologies of the day. Started this project about 10 years ago called Drawing Operations, which operated under a simple premise of human-machine collaboration, but also marks by my hand and a custom robotic unit being made on the same plane. I think at that time it was really almost engineering and technical challenge to explore how that spontaneity and that real-time effect could be translated in the space of a performance. Thinking back with what I know today, I think it was just the beginning of an exploration of how to decenter or decenter the human and think about what the embodied gesture means in the advent of new technological advances and disruptions of today. I've done, that was the beginning of a multi-year project called Drawing Operations Unit Generation 1. We're on our 5th generation, thinking about, just the role of technology and how that implicates the human subject, whether that's as an individual or a collective. Generation 2, memory involved the training of a neural network on 2 decades of my own drawing data, thinking about that embodied, drawn, artistic archive in the tradition of drawing as a behavioral input, and what that means in terms of engaging with obviously a time-based art, but also what that means to engage with it in a performance practice. I won't go through every generation, but the latest generation, Drawing Operations Unit Generation 5, as part of a exhibition actually quite inspired by Glissant as well, called Assembly Lines, is one in which I'm meditating and doing a style of mantra meditation, and actually meditating with a biosensor, an EEG headset, which converts my own artistic agency in that space into a biosignal that's then translated into a multi-robotic system. Always trying to reframe the role of the human and the role of action in the space to think about how that permeates through space as something that is live and also engages with the collective energy of an audience. So very excited to be speaking about the work today.
Thank you. I was just momentarily struck by your use of the word generation and sort of, I mean, there's that kind of like, you know, Ford Model T kind of Mark II kind of generational thing in technology, and there's also this like notion of kinship, and it reminded me of the fact that when we think about synthetic intelligence and think about, but also science, actually most natural sciences as well, you do have this also scientific kinship of knowledge between like students and advisors, and these various kinds of like maps of kinship kind of going through this kind of body of ostensibly kind of objective kind of earthly knowledge is also kind of joined together in these interesting kind of family relationships. I mean, not actually come to think of it, Dorian Sagan's introduction in the book is also seems to be quite rich with complicated family relationships. I wanted to start with, I mean, the last panel we had was about storytelling and narrative, and in some way we have a very kind of like broadly intuitive understanding of what narrative looks like. You know, there's a not necessarily linear, but there's a sort of structural kind of protagonist kind of structure to kind of conventional narrative. Whereas I mean, I guess as artists and I guess kind of more conceptual kind of practitioners, I'm kind of interested in how you're thinking about staging encounters with these more abstract processes. You know, even to my mind, the way in which Sougwen, your work is, for me, fundamentally, the important part is its performative nature. I mean, the way in which, you know, like someone like Andrew Pickering talks about, I think, like an ontological theater. Like it's not so much that, okay, someone is drawing with an AI, but more like, okay, what is the actual play of agency that is happening as the thing unfolds? And what you're seeing is really just an artifact, and a beautiful artifact, but an artifact of for me, is the more interesting process of the performance itself. And Asad, I mean, your work is coming out quite differently, but it feels like it's very much playing into that desire at the heart of conceptual art, I think, to kind of dissolve into the real world, to kind of not merely represent, but to enact metabolisms, or to enact, or, you know, I have a whole kind of back catalogue of words somewhere for like this kind of secondhand doing that art always is trying to want to do, to kind of not merely represent, like, you know, representation was kind of a mistake. Like it's
It's not enough, maybe.
Okay, yes.
I like the mistake, though. That's very bold. You know?
Yeah, the cardinal sin of like modernism. And yeah, sorry, but going back, this kind of yeah, in both those cases, there's a kind of there's a different way of ontologically encountering or staging an encounter with a type of reality, which may be perhaps through a space of abstraction of art, or through, you know, this vacuum that we call art, that we can kind of throw things into and take things out of again. And I just wonder how you're thinking about in your works about staging these encounters with like a different ontological kind of form.
Well, I think there's so many ways to unpack and answer that. I think especially with assembly lines, I'm thinking about the role of the visibility, maybe I'll start this way, the visibility of the human subject within these technological configurations can often be erased as we speculate on and anthropomorphize this idea of intelligence we were talking about earlier. But I think my physical presence as a performer in that space really resituates the human element and the embodied element of, and the biology of the human subject in these meditative rituals that I've been performing. I think that's a really important thing to bring in, because in this latest generation, maybe it's in response to a little bit of the present moment that we're in. It's about active inaction in the sense that the human subject becomes a transmitter of a biosignal, but otherwise still in the stewardship of this multi-robotic art-making collective or configuration of machines. So I think there's a decentering, obviously, of the human action in that space, but also this positing of stewardship and ritual and tradition and something against automation in the work that I'm trying to create a space for people to bear witness to. So I think there's, I think in a lot of technologically produced and mediated projects, there's this like puzzle to solve for the human subject, and there's, like, you unlock this in the installation, and then you've somehow...
Or like, get it, got it. Kind of.
Yeah, get it, got it. Like, we're no stranger to those types of works, and I really like almost inviting this space of meditation, contemplation, ritual, and maybe even a little bit of boredom in the act of witnessing that I think is quite vital to thinking about these configurations as something more of a balanced ecosystem. Yeah.
I'd like to see your work now. I, I think I approach this question a little bit from the question of form, like the form of an art experience or the form of an artwork. I was just reminded of something that, like in 2016, I was working on this project, which was a kind of symposium conference with, and Ben Rivers, who's sitting in the audience now, was making a film of that, and I never actually saw the film, but as part of what Ben Rivers and Ben Russell, who were collaborating on this film, did, they had a person in like a green cat suit, head to toe, kind of constantly walking around during this symposium and this thing, and later they were going to use that figure to kind of green screen something into the footage that they were doing, I think. And I never saw the film, as I said, but I still remember so clearly just like listening to Jean-Luc Nancy talk about philosophy and then seeing the green guy walking. And I was just like, oh my God.
Talk about witnessing.
Yes, and that intervention into the reality of the situation was so memorable, and because it was also real. And I often think about the fact that we're really used to seeing almost anything, no matter how shocking, disturbing, or unusual, on an image, on a screen, or in an image on a painting or a photograph. But to have things occurring in embodied daily life around you is so much more affecting, because your proprioception gets involved and your sense of smell gets involved. And so I have a different work where I was thinking a lot about the question of land and identity and ecologies, and I had this thought to make artificial soil using ingredients that you collect around a city, and then fill a museum with it and give some to each visitor who comes to use, because working with soil scientists, I made sure that it was actually fertile and healthy, even though it contained all this different stuff like spent barley from breweries and hair from hair salons and sand and clay and pigeon droppings and like all kinds of stuff. But it would be that when you walked in, you don't just walk in on a paved human floor or a carpeted floor that's made for you. You walk on uneven ground, and you feel that uneven ground under your shoes, and you smell the smell of geosmin, or the bacterial life that occurs in wet soil, because we also keep cultivating and spraying with water and turning over the soil so that it stays moist and fertile. And then, you know, you're offered some to take home, and then you have it at your house, and maybe even a few years later it's still in one particular pot on your balcony. So those were all ways I was trying to think about how can I kind of break out of the box of like being up here on the screen with you, to where, like, you know, Ben's green guy got to me. And so I think when you think about how can we stage the complexities that science and art both are trying to find metaphors for, it often, to me, involves going beyond just contemplating visually or orally, or, aurally, or linguistically.
Well, what I really love about that too is it brings in the reality of decay into the artistic practice, right? The decay of sand, the smell of sand, the texture of it. And I think that's one thing that I find really vital about my performance practice, and this idea that you would have the visitors drink the water of the river, is that the human body in this case, and the decay of the body aging through time or whatnot, is brought back into the frame, and not as an image, just an image of it, but as something that has a presence, that has an end. And I think that's sort of against what we think of as, you know, like technological solutionism of this perfection of that's quite trendy in how we think about technological configurations, which is more in cybernetic forms, for instance. I think there's something really essential about returning us to that idea and making us sit with it in art practice.
Yeah, I guess, and part of what I'm hearing you guys talk about is also a kind of like, the form is partly space and scale, like the kind of process is already perhaps there. It is part of this kind of worldly, you were part of many complex and massive processes at the same time, but then like the kind of artistic form is partly about kind of tuning the time and perception of those things around us. At the same time, to speak of scale on another level, you made me think like, okay, like, is agroforestry and geoengineering projects, are they also artworks? Are they also like these huge kind of transformations of both time and Gaia and of our kind of relationship to the environment?
Do you have a question, Gary?
No. No, I'm just enjoying the moment.
Let's just sit with that.
But I think what you're saying is something I feel intuitively too, which is that I used to think very much about the exhibition as the relevant unit. The thing of relevance, so to speak, is the exhibition, whether it's 6 weeks, 6 days a week, or whether it's 14 weeks, 5 days, whatever. That was where I thought reality was, because I was in the business of giving experience to the visitor, and that's where they were going to have that experience. But slowly I kind of got more into thinking about that they access part of something that maybe goes over a longer time span. And so more different kinds of initiatives, like the last 2 years I was working in Birmingham together with Raza, who's here, and Cooking Sections on a project where I was trying to help remediate the soil of a toxic soil contaminated with heavy metals all around Grand Union, which is an art institution in Birmingham. And it was like for a really long time. And in the past I would always think, oh, okay, where are the visitors and what are they going to experience and what should I do to get into their phenomenological experience. But in this case, I was like, actually, let's just focus on trying to fix this problem here, which no one knows how to fix, and then we'll find a way for visitors to kind of get engaged with it. So it was a slight difference, and I think that's something more and more as artists we are starting to see, that like being only inside the box of the exhibition time span is maybe not so much sufficient anymore.
Definitely.
That reminds me of an art practitioner who, Annie Liu, I believe, who did the work
Liu,
with the kombucha. Yeah. Was that
I think New York based,
Yeah, and it was a really beautiful work, but talking about resituating our idea of what an exhibition does, or what the interaction the artist or author is encouraging from docents in this case. Like there's a layer, like a leathered kombucha that hangs from a stand that as part of the exhibition, the docents in the exhibition had to take care of the living organism within the space, which is such a lovely way of bringing in that reality into the exhibition that really challenges what these representations are meant to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I also have been in many conversations with other artists and sort of practitioners about how, in a way, the insufficiency of the exhibition as a form, or like or at least just kind of provincializing it as a particular form that was interesting of itself, but like it just can't contain like everything. And I mean, the works that you do, Asad, as well, you always reminded me of, you must know like Helen and Newton Harrison in the 70s. No? Oh my God, you should definitely. They're kind of the legend. They're the legendary. I mean, I guess you call them land artists. They were first like make soil as work in the late 60s, I think. But also, they did a lot of kind of bringing ecosystems into galleries. Like they did a whole kind of catfish tank in the Barbican where they did aquaponics and then feasted on a catfish at the end of the show, which was very, very controversial. But perhaps more importantly, they also exited the exhibition space and basically made a gigantic geological plan for Europe for like kind of ecologically redesigning the kind of nation states of Europe, and like in a truly ambitious, like multi-year kind of way. And this was all like, I think in the 90s. I mean, I think Helen passed away a few years ago, and Newton must be in his 90s now. And okay, so I guess one thing that I wanted to think about also is, in a sense, the politics of Gaia. I mean, when we're having these conversations in these spaces, and it's all very nice to think about entanglements, I do kind of sometimes, I mean, I was reminded there was a tweet a little while ago which went something like, I can't believe the environmental humanities spent the last 10 years talking about how matter vibrates. And while I actually grew up on that stuff as well, and like I appreciate it in many ways, but I feel like our engagements with the entanglements and complexity often decentres our own agency and our own kind of ability to propose and to conceptualize to a degree that we kind of recede, or like ask ourselves to recede from this kind of more kind of re-enchanted universe. And what I kind of appreciated about the Gaia book is that they actually speak about a very indifferent kind of Gaia. It's more like the human speck is is going to come and go, and this eon long stability is going to kind of self-modulate and self-perpetuate itself. But at the same time, there is a sort of species level as well as subjective level and community level set of politics about 1.5 degrees is almost certainly going to happen, and we are deeply entangled, but that doesn't actually remove any of our responsibilities to each other at very least, if not to other species. And I wonder how you think about those kinds of those politics, because sometimes I worry that we get kind of lost in the kaleidoscope of branching epistemes and sort of lose sight of like a future that we're kind of actively creating.
Are you passing it to me now?
I'm not doing anything right
now. Yeah, no, it's obviously that's such a vital and
it's up to you guys, by the way, to answer this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
All, I mean, as artists,
I mean, being in the space that I'm in, which is thinking about technology and its effects on the framing of the human subject, as well as my own artistic practice. I think, and building this multi-generational cybernetic, which some people would define as a cybernetic series of art-making systems. I think there's so much of that process of authorship and invention and thinking that really sort of dematerializes the technology involved, and I think that's why trends in public consciousness and the zeitgeist, like around artificial intelligence and technological solutionism, really distract from the real, the material consequences of emerging trends in futurist thought. Let's put it that way, maybe. So in that way, especially coming back to this idea of Gaian systems and thinking about Gaian systems theory as a cybernetic systems theory makes a lot of sense, because cybernetic systems in general don't really, I think they, how do I phrase this? I think they are guilty of being almost too theoretical and thinking about the materiality of the processor and the rare earth minerals that are involved with designing the microchip that actually returns it to this idea of sustainability and the earth and the ecologies in which these systems, technological systems, are entangled. So I think that framing of Gaia Today as part of the accidental megastructure of technology and networks is a way of sitting with and thinking more deeply about the real consequences of some of the movements in today's technological landscape.
I think what resonated with me about what you said, Gary, I mean, I think this was actually very, I'd like to think more about that, but I don't have time right now. The issue is with, for instance, thinking about matter vibrating in a situation like that one we're in is that it could be taking away time or something from dealing with more urgent political, ecological issues. And that brings up this larger question of art and how can art be efficacious. I used to do more political activism. When I was younger, I organized a strike at NYU, and I was involved in like this kind of political stuff in New York. And it was pretty frustrating because in the end we lost everything and it didn't really, work. And something that appealed to me about art, which I heard from Tino Segal one time, was that art can engage in politics at a slightly deeper level by trying to inject or create new desires, and where politics is often stuck ratifying the desires of people, especially in democracies, although you could argue that even that is not happening efficiently these days. But but I think that now to go maybe to Margulis's friend, James Lovelock, I think he writes well about the issue of non-linear thinking and intuition in making discoveries, and especially how important they are in science. But I think it's quite clear that that's also important in many other fields. And so for me also this, it's maybe not like for me as an artist to direct you what to think about, but maybe I can help you get into a space where more nonlinear thinking and intuitive connections could be made. And I try to work on it from that basis.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with that. I mean, I think we have such a poor language for nonlinearity. We just don't have a good, I don't know if other languages than English, and I mean, yeah, I'm not familiar with if there are languages that have a much better way of speaking about kind of self-aware systems and kind of conscious processes, but we really have a very hard time thinking about that, I think. And I mean, I guess, yeah, one hopes that maybe artworks is a way, art is a space which can kind of help you abstract out of that space and sort of change the light settings and change the kind of like temporalities of your experience a little bit to kind of start to shift that window.
I would say it's both abstract from and also concretize away from, both to make more abstract but more concrete too.
Yes.
Than typical accounts of language, politics through language.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I guess concrete to experience, I suppose you mean, yeah. Yeah, I mean, that actually brings me to a similar kind of contradictory thought I always have about this kind of ecology situation, which is that it feels like many narratives are breaking down, and it feels like many things are fragmenting, and we're seeing these different metabolisms and what Marx would call metabolic rifts, like this kind of running away from different systems at different speeds that kind of conflict with each other in terms of their needs and resources. But at the same time, this has been going on for quite a long time. And to me, it seems almost more like we can't face the synchronization. Like we can't quite grasp, we don't have a narrative framing or a linear temporal framing to grasp how all of these things are happening at once. And there isn't a story we can tell that would nicely synthesize that together in a way that makes sense. In the way that, even a narrative like globalization sort of made sense in all of its strange, somehow it was a world that we could live in. But then, that's one narrative that seems to be fragmenting a lot at the moment, for example. I don't have a question attached to that, I have to say. I'm going to have to...
We like hearing your thoughts, too.
No, I think
that's good to know.
The construction of narrative as that pertains to the human subject is always, I think right now that asynchronization of it and that sort of dispersal of that is quite exciting, because I think we've seen what happens when the human subject as an idea is relegated to one thing. It's what I really appreciate about the decentering of the human in Gaian theory and Gaian systems, is that it's about a larger and broader ecological landscape, particularly in modern Gaia, thinking about the view of Earth from space, I think is interesting, as it is a view that's necessitates technological mediation, but also is a narrative of the fragility, the sort of fragility maybe of the planet that I think might be a unifying narrative that could aid in beyond sort of more lofty and theoretical ideas of temporality and vibrating matter, but this idea that we're sort of spatially on this one block, that I find maybe a nice narrative to move forward. I'm also not anti-narrative, but representation was a mistake, obviously. But I'm about the moment. But thinking about the Gaian narrative and how it addresses urgent ecological issues today, I think, is one reason why we're all sitting here in Saturday in the afternoon talking about it.
Yeah. It's almost time to open up some questions. Does anyone have any? There's a roving mic at the back.
Hello. I'm sorry I'm not native English speaking, so
no, please.
might be slightly odd. I wonder what you think about the ability of humans to identify. I think it's in something very strong in a bad and in a good sense, you know, thinking about nationalism, which is in the way at the moment, and from a Gaia perspective, it would be like identifying with a more complex system. What's your thought about that?
Was the question was about the ability of humans to identify, such as in nationalism, but how do you mean how humans might identify with Gaia, let's say? You guys have thoughts on identification?
I have thoughts on anthropomorphization, which was I think very front and center when I first started working with these embodied robotic systems. I'm really obviously as the builder of these configurations, I have my I called the drawing operations Doug, and it was a sort of entity in my mind unto itself. But I also found in these performance spaces this amazing connection of the audience with what is an inanimate object. And I find that to be so wonderful about the porosity of human subjective experience, in that you can sort of see and oneself in the other than human inanimate things. I think it's quite stirring, and I think maybe the human psyche wants to decenter itself by dispersing itself, which I'm not sure if other species on the planet have that. I'm not ruling it out, but I find that is almost like a reaction to maybe some sorts of nationalism and a closing of one's identity that I find interesting in the work, in my explorations.
Sarah, there's a question just behind you.
It's more of a prompt, actually. I love the idea of soil as a data set. I love the idea of training a GPT on a language model composed of a single piece of language. Like the process of, like, could you imagine the process of richly training an AI on a language model of like a single word or a single phrase, and what kind of process that would entail?
What if it was also not in the language that we understood, and it was a phrase in another language? I think that could be interesting too. I did this thing last year where I tried to work with languages that were not normally written down, to try to create another contribution to like an oral culture that had to be learned in another way. And so we made this melody. I worked with these people from the Seneca Language Institute to make a melody that also communicated in Seneca. But what I found was when it was sung, you didn't really miss, not whether you knew or not the meaning. It was interesting because people were still find something there. And that actually reminds me also of Glissant, who used to do poetry readings in Paris, where people would read poems in many different languages, and he would not have translation, so that, and he often said that those ones where you don't understand were the were as valuable, or maybe even more valuable, as being in a different space of attention, you know. So like in our case, we had this this melody. Dejinya chase, Dejinya chase, Gawenisa, Gawenisa, Gado Guaita, Gado Guaita. And I don't have to tell you what it means. But it does something also that maybe language doesn't do, or does do too.
That was very beautiful. Oh, wow.
Well, I love that just shifts our understanding of what this gathering is just by, just by adding that kind of tonality and melody to what is, potentially a very heady panel. I think it just creates this space of vulnerability and witnessing and tradition that I think is just such a powerful and immediate effect of human performance. So yeah, that was great.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Sorry.
guys. I mean, you get a little talked
Exciting.
out at these things.
Yeah. Yeah, I prefer drawing to talking.
Do we have any questions from the audience? There was one thing I remember suddenly struck by reading the actual book today, and since you both work in some level with kind of social practices or kind of performative practices, in the book they kind of, am I right in thinking in the book, in the essay they basically say that, human politics and kind of social response, as well as even legislation, is also part of the Gaian system. I was kind of really struck by this kind of incorporation of the very much the anthropos and all like the social into as part of this system, like almost in a very I don't know, like a hyper materialist kind of way to really like, and in a certain way to really like get rid of the agency of the human. To say that like whatever uproar, whatever kind of like good.
So much for free will.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I was quite struck by that. It's like, yeah.
But I like that point because it's also, it feels accurate to me because it is that what we are doing is also part of the same biotope. Actually, also interesting to me that even this planet, it's not only this planet. In the Gaia theory, obviously one of the main things that is a justification for the fact that this planet is able to regulate itself is that the sun got 30% hotter in the last 2 billion years since life arrived, or 3.7 billion years, and yet the climate of the Earth did not. And so how did that happen? So this dynamically changing solar input is a huge part of it, but the solar input is not the only input of radiation and photons that we're getting here. Actually, at any given moment, even to like some very small percentage of the radiation that is picked up as static by an antenna is coming from the cosmic microwave background. So it's like literally still bouncing around from 13 billion years ago, and it can be measured. The blue or red shift of it can be measured in each one of those. So, let's say something I think is very important to try and bring our nonlinear attention to is this continuousness that we are part of. It sounds a little weird, but I think that's something I'm interested to try and to get at.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me, my gateway drug in philosophy a little bit was Bataille, and in eroticism, he really, there's this kind of quite spirituous idea of like the continuousness of the world, and the only way discontinuity sort of happens is really through like the birth of an ego as such, the kind of moment, the self, the kind of, this thing that we're in many ways trying to decenter or blame for many of the kind of issues that, we face is, and for him, it's like, singing together, or death, or orgasm. I think those are his three actually. Are the moments of kind of when you dissolve a bit into the continuousness again.
Does that get really nihilistic real quick, or
why nihilistic?
fatalistic?
Why nothing? Or like why?
I think I'm just playing devil's advocate here because why not? But I think that removes it removes human agency, and I shouldn't be, maybe I'm not the best person to talk about it because I'm constantly trying to reframe my own agency in space, but I think that this idea that these political shifts are just another manifestation of the, not the Gaian will, but I think that removes our own responsibility to our own species as something separate from the ecological surrounds, which, just throwing it out there. But I think to depending on how much coffee I've had, it gets really nihilistic.
I agree. I mean, there is a version, which is why I was struck by it in the essay, because there's a version of that which is a bit like kind of, 19th century kind of syncretic sciences, where like everything is like, all culture is like actually an expression of geology or something, and it actually gets you into like eugenics pretty quickly if you really want to follow a particular line. But but at the same time, we do have to deal with the material as well, right? I mean, we have to deal with the kind of ecological cards that we're dealt, and there's a pretty good hand, but we still need to kind of like navigate it in some way, and the sun is our source of energy. I'm with you though. I think I'm kind of, for me, it like desire, maybe this is the Bataillon thing again, like this kind of idea you mentioned earlier, was it Rickritz or someone else who, the other arts might kind of like reach into our deeper desires and what are the organizing forces of desire. And if we start thinking about these kind of material desire as a material force, then you kind of start kind of bridging these different metabolisms between the material and the social and the imaginative and so on.
Well, I also feel kind of proud that our political deliberations and stuff would be like part of the system or adding something, because, if you think about us compared to cyanobacteria or whatever, like Lynn Margulies talks about. Me too. And that's why we're here probably. We're weird people who think about cyanobacteria all the time. And they were kind of hanging out here for mostly on their own for like several 100 million years, creating all the oxygen that fills up the atmosphere. So like they made a huge, much bigger, like their Parliament's decisions were making a much bigger impact than ours. So even the fact that we could be included is, I'm taking exactly the opposite position of you. I'm saying I'm proud that we're even having a little bit of a vote.
So you had coffee.
Yeah, and I did have coffee.
In the UN conference room of, us and cyanobacteria and gazelles, which to be fair, I think, aren't cyanobacteria on strike right now? And aren't they, I think they're currently...
Only in Germany.
I think they're currently responsible for not deflecting enough light. Like there's these huge algae blooms. Someone might know this here, but I think there's an issue with the amount of sunlight that's deflected by these vast fields of cyanobacteria.
They've unionized.
Exactly. Yeah. All my bacteria have unionized. I don't know what to do about it.
That sounds like something for the previous panel to write a narrative about.
Rachel, over here. Sorry, not to actually call you out.
I was a bit embarrassed to be named before. Hello, I'm Rachel.
It's Rachel Pym, everybody. It's Rachel Pym.
I wanted to, you were talking about politics, which I think is important to talk about in terms of how we, manage our whole globe simultaneously. There was a word that, Sougwen, you said stewardship early on, and I really thought, I don't think a lot of artists have really sort of maybe made that realization that what they're doing is holding and caring for something for a moment. And it goes back to the idea of the exhibition being like a point in the life of these material transformations. So I wanted to, and maybe diverting is a similar thing, right? It's just a point. How did you, it's a stupid question in some way, how did you get to the point where you thought that's actually a good word for being an artist, is stewarding? Because it's quite beautiful, really.
Thank you.
Or responsible and accountable.
I would say I'm in the practice definitely. It's something it's hard. It's difficult. It's something I think I'm still working on. I feel like it's so loaded with responsibility, which I think I came to it through. I don't think there's one particular path of arriving at stewardship as an idea, but I think this idea of tending to, this is really nerdy, so I'm responding in a very.
Please let out.
When creating a multi-robotic system and tending to those multiple units, it does end up occupying the space of, I started feeling like a gardener of all these different organisms in my mind, because I anthropomorphize very, very readily ask anyone. But I think there's that, but then there, in a wider frame, I think working in the space of AI systems for the past 10 years, I think there's a stewardship of human tradition, such as ritual, such as drawing, that, and a confluence of other things that I feel a personal responsibility towards, is I think some of the narratives around AI systems have a tendency to erase and flatten and reduce these practices to data points and data sets, which is just fundamentally not true. Singing in a room, it cannot be reduced to a wave file. There's something so much more powerful about that. And I do think whether aware of it or not, artistic practitioners and practitioners of other maybe what people would describe as craft steward the tradition of that culture, that work in their own way, and I think that lends itself to the organisms and devices around us, and has so many other implications that I think from a systems standpoint is quite captivating and necessary.
Yeah, that's really it's very beautiful, and it also reminds me of this. I mean, in the essay, they kind of are at pains to make a separation between cybernetics and autopoiesis, which I think of also as similar to second-order cybernetics, I guess. Like, rather than purely the controlling the rigid state, it's like being aware that you are, in a sense, a steward or a gardener or something in the system. You're a participant in the you are traffic as well, and you're kind of arranging and choreographing around you, but you're also part of it, and you have in some ways an agential responsibility to the things around you. I think we need more language around that.
And I think that's what happens when you sort of decenter the human and sort of bring it down to the level of the collective, the environment. I think that paralyzing of what we think of as our lofty human authorship and intention is a primary component of arriving at and exploring that notion.
If we don't have any final questions, are there? Okay, one. Okay.
Thank you. I was really curious though, especially when you guys are talking about anthropomorphism and embodying, that puts, I suppose, like this sort of alien logic of a different like organism into human terms, and that in and of itself is also a narrative that might not be so simpatico with, like, I suppose, like the unhierarchy of like Gaia theory. And I was wondering how like that sort of like works out. Yeah.
Could you repeat that question?
Yeah, I think it was mostly just, I was just mostly wondering if, like, since anthropomorphism is putting everything, I suppose, within a human construct and relating to human logic, how that is, like, how that relates to, like, a sort of, like, non-hierarchy that we're trying to move away from, I suppose, of people being on the hierarchy in terms of ecological and other organisms.
Yeah, I think you're exposing a little bit of the contradiction of that, right? Which I agree with. I agree with, and I think for me, I think there's again, working with machines that I can turn on and off that are sometimes broken in space. There's still so much empathy, so much warmth, so much of that human projection onto this inanimate organism, and I find, and we're talking about like the feeling of extension that happens in at a funeral, I think in the previous panel. I think that's less about trying to see the humanity necessarily, because I don't think anyone's thinking like anthropomorphizing a robot and thinking, oh, that robot like does human behaviors, but I think it's that energy to move one's individual self outward that is the decentering, and it's a reverse paradoxical way of getting there. But I think it's a quite natural impulse that I've seen in the people that I've met. So.
Before we end it there, I'd like to draw your attention to the Bloom AR app, which is by Sammy Lee, which an artist commissioned for this event, which is an exploration of Gaian experience. So you can sort of move around this kind of swirling, iridescent globe and explore it in your own space. I think Sarah is demonstrating it.
Oh, I wasn't demonstrating it. Oh, well, actually, here we go. The artist Sammy Lee has actually affectionately named this planet Gary. So
I was only made aware of this very recently.
So Gary, you've been visiting temples in Korea and London Book Fair and all over the place. But thank you so much for a mind-blowing panel. And I'm going to take me and my bacteria upstairs to the workshop room and for polymorphic microbodies. So if you enjoyed the song, then please do come to shift into a different sort of modality, which is more embodied and an internal symphony of sorts. It was fully booked out, but if you are on the waiting list, please do make your way up to the room in case you can get in. I think that's probably possible. Otherwise, please come back to this room for artist films, and we'll begin with Asad's Go. Thank you.
To hear more podcasts from Tank, you can subscribe on all major podcast platforms or follow us on SoundCloud. The theme music for this podcast is by Himera.